Hey everybody, welcome back. We are talking right now about vowels. This is going to correspond to chapter 4 in your text. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with just a brief introduction to some of the terminology associated with vowels. And then we're going to have a short lecture on front vowels and back vowels, which is what we're covering this week. Next week, we're going to talk about other types of vowels. We're going to talk about the central vowels and diphthongs. Okay. So, sorry, sometimes my PowerPoint doesn't want to move. Okay, so today we're talking about the differences between vowels and consonants. We're gonna talk about pure vowels versus diphthongs, and we're gonna talk about how we categorize vowels based on how we make them in the articulatory tract. So whether they're made in the front of the mouth versus the back, whether they're made high or low. So we'll get into that. Okay. So the basic difference between consonants and vowels is that a consonant involves a constriction or obstruction in the vocal tract, where vowels do not. Okay, so airflow is going through the vocal tract unobstructed to make a vowel. And depending on where articulators are, different vowels are produced. And we're going to get into that in a minute. Okay. Another significant important thing to remember, and we talked about this last week when we talked in a little mini lecture on syllables, is that a vowel makes up the nucleus of a syllable. Okay, so in order for something to be a syllable, it has to have a vowel. Now, there is an exception to that. There are some consonants who act as a syllable, but we're not going to get into that anytime soon. We're going to talk about that much later on later in the semester when we talk about syllables. Okay. It's important to remember that there are some sounds which they are still categorized as consonants, so they cannot act as the nucleus of a syllable, but they're made closely like vowels in the vocal tract, so more open vocal tract than other consonants. So one of them is the y sound, such as in you. And so you don't get tripped up by this, that what looks like a lowercase j is actually the IPA symbol for y. And then the w sound, such as in where or why. So this week, we're going to be talking about pure vowels. So this is one single sound represented by one IPA symbol. So, for example, E, as in feet, is a pure vowel. It's one articulation of a sound, okay? And again, don't get tripped up that this is a lowercase I letter. This is the IPA symbol, which you are learning this week for that sound, which we typically think of that as the long E sound, right? Diphthongs are actually two vowel sounds together. So if you look at the bottom of this slide, you'll see that, and we sometimes do this when we're doing articulation therapy with kids. We'll start with one sound and we'll gradually bring the other sound closer to it so that they can eventually put those two sounds together to make diphthong. Okay? Since it is actually two articulation movements for these diphthongs, it's actually represented with what we call a digraph, which is it's going to have two IPA symbols. Okay? We're going to talk about diphthongs next week, so I'm not going to get into too much detail here now. This is an image of the vowel quadrilateral. This is something that you will need to memorize. Next week, we're going to brainstorm some ideas to help you memorize it, because it probably seems pretty abstract right now if you haven't already studied phonetics. But it is something that we are going to definitely be learning as we go through the vowel chapter. This is a simplified version. We're not studying all the vowels of the world. We're just studying English vowels in this class. So as you could see, we categorize vowels based on how we produce the sounds. So front, central, and back is referring to where your tongue is, whether it's in the front of your mouth, um, central mid part of your mouth, or in the back. Okay. And we're going to talk about this in great detail. Um, so on this vowel quadrilateral, front, central, and back is our x-axis. And then our y-axis in this chart is what is the height of our tongue. So whether it's higher in our mouth, like with the E, or whether it's low, as in okay? So we're going to go through that a little bit more as we go through the different vowels, but just so you have an image right now. Okay. So we can actually take the vowel quadrilateral that we're just talking about and superimpose it onto an image of our vocal tract. And right here, you see that we have the image going, the tongue going from the front of our mouths to the back, as well as the height within our mouth. Okay. So height is how tongue it is, how high your tongue is in relation to the roof of your mouth. Okay, so I just gave you an example of the E, which is a very high vowel, versus A, which is a low vowel. Okay, and you can feel it if you say those sounds out loud. And I encourage you as you're going through this to actually say the sounds out loud. Where is your tongue in your mouth horizontally refers to whether it's a front vowel or a back vowel, for example. So a sound like E or a sound like O, okay? So you could feel your tongue. So let's go back to this picture of it. So you could see that E is made in the front, whereas O is made in the back, okay? We also talk about whether our lips are rounded or not, and we use this a lot when we're teaching kids who are having trouble with speech therapy. So, or having trouble making their sounds, which is why they're in speech therapy. So, a lot of kids who have, especially motor speech disorders, their tongue kind of stays in this central position. So everything sounds like and this can really affect their ability to be understood, what we call their intelligibility, because the vowel is what changes the meaning of a word, right? So if you say but instead of bit or beat, it changes the meaning. Okay, so we often have to help children by giving them cues of what they need to do with their articulators. So when we are retracting our lips, like for E, that makes a nice E sound. So sometimes we'll tell kids, smile when you make that sound to help them if they're rounding their lips when they shouldn't be, and vice versa. If they're working on, let's say, the O sound, they need to have that nice rounded lips, O, in order to get that sound versus just where that's not rounded enough to make that nice crisp O sound. We also talk about whether vowels are tense or lax, okay? And that's really whether there's tension in the tongue, okay? So if you think using E a lot because it's a very prominent vowel, we call it a cardinal vowel. So lots of times when we're working with children, we'll use some type of a visual to represent tenseness. So sometimes we'll take like a rubber band or one of those toys that stretches so they could actually feel what do we mean when we say tense, right? So a sound like E, it's a very tense vowel versus which is very lax, right? There's no tension. Okay. All right. We also want to think about where our tongue is in our mouth. Okay. So high vowels, you could feel your tongue touching the roof of your mouth. Okay. And they're sometimes referred to as closed vowels because the jaw is more closed. So look at my mouth when I say E. It's not wide open, right? If it is, so try and make the E sound with your mouth wide open. Yeah, right? It's going to be all distorted if you try and do that. Low vowels, so the converse of high, obviously low, your jaw is going to be open. So, you could see how much more my mouth is open, to make that low vowel sound. The mid vowels are going to be produced somewhere in between. Okay. All right. So let's look at this and kind of make these sounds out loud when you're watching this. So I'm going to start with E, and then go to A, and go to E, and you could see my mouth gradually opening and my jaw, right, dropping as I go from high to low. And you could feel your tongue again, moving to these different positions. So this is a sagittal view, side view of what your articulators would look like when you're making these different vowels. So as you can see on the left is the E, where the lips are retracted, right? And it's high versus oo, as in the word who, where you could see the opening of that vocal tract, and you could see it moving back, right? So we just talked about height. Now we're going to talk about what we call advancement, which is moving from front to back. So our x-axis on our chart here. So the vowel E is not only high, but it's made in the front of the mouth. You could have a high vowel that's also made in the back of the mouth. So ooh, ooh. It's high, but your tongue is also pulled back. So another low vowel, which we talked about before, was ah. So ah is way in the back, right? It's low, but it's also way in the back. Your tongue is pulled back versus ah, which it's a low vowel, but your tongue is forward. Okay, so how we move our tongue is very important to the vowels that we articulate. And we're going to talk about the central vowels next week, so I'm not going to get into that right now. As I mentioned, we talk about tense versus lax. And really a good way to remember this, besides just memorizing the different vowels, is whether it can occur in a closed or open syllable. So tense vowels can occur in either open or closed syllables. We tend to think of these as long vowels, but you cannot, that's not 100% foolproof because they're not always are long vowels. But E, it's tense, right? You feel the tension, E, and we could hear that and see it if it was written in a open syllable like he. Lax vowels can only occur in closed syllables, and we tend to think of lax vowels often as the short vowels, but again, not always. So really trying to remember if you're having trouble figuring out whether it's tense or lax, think about it in a syllable and whether it could occur there as a foolproof weapon. We just talked about rounding, so I gave you an example of oh, ooh, those you have to round your lips to produce them accurately. Unrounded or retracted, you don't see that rounding. You see more with what we call like a smile. The lips are pulled back. So is very tense and pulled back. So lip spreading is another term that we use. Vowels are typically voiced. Your vocal cords are moving when you produce a vowel. So if you put your hand on your vocal cords and create some vowels, say some vowels, you will feel it. So E, ah, ooh, you can feel your vocal cords vibrating, right? We make vowels with a closed velum. We talked about this a little bit in our last video. The exception would be when the phonetic environment involves a nasal consonant, like n or m or n. When we have a nasal consonant next to a vowel, it's going to change how we produce that vowel. So vowels will be what we call nasalized when they're produced next to a nasal consonant. And that's because when we make sounds, we're actually putting articulators into the position for other sounds that are in a word. So for example, if I say two, it's an open syllable, I'm just worrying about that vowel. But if I say ton, that N is at, or the N sound is at the end, and that is going to change the quality of that vowel that precedes it. So here's an example, long versus log. You could kind of feel that nasal quality to the vowel in long. So in our IPA charts, or vowel quadrilateral charts, we represent tenseness with a triangle. If you need to remember, just think T for triangle, tense. And we represent rounding with a circle. So if you think about the mouth when you're making a sound, such as O, it looks like a circle. So that's a good way to remember it. Now, as you could see, this is not an either or thing. Some vowels can be tensed and round. Okay. So these are the pure vowels. These are the vowels that are not diphthongs, which we're going to study next week. So it's helpful to try and think of a key word to remember which vowels are which. So that's up to you what kind of keyword you want to choose. Sometimes it's helpful if you're keeping the consonants constant, as in this example. So beat, bit, bait, bet, bat. So obviously that one doesn't help. Bird, butter, but, boot, book, boat, bought, and bought. So you could see my jaw changing, you could see the rounding of my lips when I was moving through all these different vowels. So we're going to spend this week working on, as I mentioned, the front and back vowels. We're not going to cover all of these this week. Just in summary, when we're talking about vowels, we're going to talk about whether they're high, mid, or low. So your tongue is high in your mouth, or central or low. I'm sorry, mid or low. We're going to talk about, remember when we're looking at our quadrilateral, that x-axis was whether your tongue was front, central, or back. So E in the front, ah in the back. And then we're going to talk about whether the sound is made with a tense tongue or lax. So again, E is tense and ah is lax. And then whether your mouth is rounded, so it's an O, or whether it's retracted, it's an E. Okay, so that's it for this introduction to vowels, and we're gonna jump right into front vowels next. So thank you for joining, and I will see you the next lecture.